Okay, this is Jimmy Jive, and you're listening to Motor City Rock Talk. Tonight, my guest, a vocalist from the band Rhythm Corps, who I've been a huge fan of ever since the very first time I heard Broken Halos, which was, of course, actually Rhythm Method before they changed the name. Just so many great songs, so many great performances. I remember seeing them at Hart Plaza and a lot of the club scenes at that time in the 80s, late 80s, up to the time that they relocated to California. So anyway, today my guest is the vocalist from that band, Mr. Michael Persh. How you doing, Mike?
I'm well, James. How are you?
I'm really good. It's great to finally speak to you. I know you're busy out in California, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Anyway, can we start with a little background? Tell me a little bit about like where you're from, in Michigan, maybe some of your earliest influences, band-wise, music-wise, that helped you decide you wanted to get into the music business.
I was, I spent my childhood in a city called Inkster, Michigan, so it's right off of my backyard, looked onto Middle Belt Road. Across the street, you could see Henry VIII's topless togas, but I lived there, so that's like between Michigan Avenue and Ann Arbor Trail, I suppose. Right. That's where I grew up. That's where I went to school. I went to Parkwood Elementary, which is not there anymore, and then played Mellot baseball in that league over there in Inkster and had a great time. And then at some point, I was sent to St. Matthew's Lutheran School, parochial school in Westland, where I met a couple of friends that I've known since then. By the way, is a real luxury, having friends that you've known since, you were 10, it's really rare, I think. But anyway, so in that realm, in that world, we were all exposed to, it's like 1963, and of course the Beatles had just premiered on Ed Sullivan. On top of that, my uncle played in a rock band that was quite well known around Detroit. At the time, they were called the Sunliners. The Sunliners became rarer. So my uncle played bass and sang and wrote, and I would go over to my cousin's house where my uncle would rehearse, and I would see all the, there's kit drum, there's bass, there's guitar, there's amps. I mean, just seeing the nuts and bolts of music when you're 5 is very influential. Of course, you have to remember that back then, music was so much more powerful within cultural landscape. It was where you got your style, fashion. It was where you sort of found your group of people. It was where you got your cultural insight or even your political insight. That's what music was back then. So I'm going to say that I was influenced from a very early age. Beatles certainly. Growing up in Inkster, Motown was huge, and I was okay with Motown. But what I really liked was funk. So we're talking about Sly and the Family Stone.
Oh yeah.
I mean, early bands like that. Let's just go with Ohio Players.
Were you into like Parliament, Funkadelic, George Clinton, and all
Parliament,
that?
Funkadelic, they were actually a little more underground than I was aware of. They really were underground, but Ohio Players weren't, and Sly and the Family Stone weren't. And then my uncle, who was he was on Motown Records, we were at Motown. Huge influences on me. You'll still, as a matter of fact, if you go into my Spotify account, you'll find a couple of playlists that harken back to Detroit 1971.
So is the band like I mentioned in the introduction? I know before you became Rhythm Corps, you were Rhythm Method, and I think there was form of the band or early stage of it that even had a name other than that. Was the band based out of Inkster too? By the time you actually started, actually playing in a band and developing your style?
No, in Inkster I got together with just some local guys. We were just all experimenting. Eventually, my uncle gave me a Gibson LGO acoustic guitar and said, "Here, you want to play this?" And I started writing music. I started writing songs on that. Eventually, I started finding people who were into that. You have to understand that the school I was going to, small school, and most of the guys that I knew were just, they were just guys. They knew everything about sport, and I knew everything about music, but I was like one of the few guys, and every guy had to join the team, whether it's baseball, football, basketball, whatever. You didn't have a choice. You had, that's how few people we had. So being part of the team was certainly part of it, but I was a musician. Felt that before I knew it. And then for the guys, Davey, so I grew up, let's say, Inkster, Michigan, let's call it West Side. Davey grew up Redford. Let's not forget Fabio. Fabio was also a member of the, original band, and he grew up on the, in Redford. And then Richie and Greg were like Madison Heights, East Side and West Side. We did not get together quite a while. As a matter of fact, we had all been playing out for a while, and were somewhat seasoned in terms of what we liked and what we were looking for. And when we found each other, we were strangers. We didn't really know each other. other sort of like come together. And I'm going to bet on Greg, because Greg is the one who basically started, his old band, the Plugs, started to dissolve. He said, I'm going to figure something out. And he got me, and he brought me into his world. And in that world was Richie Loveson, my drummer. And by the way, if we don't know, Greg Capro is my the guitar player in the band. And Davey is my bass player, Davey Bass, who also plays and writes. Very creative on his side, very creative on Greg's side. And of course, I was writing this. So we saw each other, and we just kind of like gravitated and stayed together. I guess what we saw was like what we wanted to do was sort of being opened up to us as we were rehearsing. And that's how the band began and then just evolved. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense as far as that. So what's interesting to me is I kind of knew that you were West Side, like you mentioned, and you mentioned your bass player from Redford, but I had no idea that you two were from this side of town. I always assumed Rhythm Corps because the band played a lot on the east side. That was the big thing, at least in the heyday, as far as that, before, the big jump to LA. So I always assumed you guys were an east side band, not only because of where you played, but because of the sound, because at that time, this is the other thing that gravitated me so much towards your band and your music. You guys were so unique sounding, and still are to this day. In my opinion, you guys were playing and creating wasn't out there as far as the mainstream, and definitely not locally. The only local band that I can think of that had anywhere near the kind of sound or thing to you guys would have been possibly Rob Roy. But you guys created this sound that was so enveloping, and it was so involved, crafted so well. Even from the earliest stages, I could say Broken Halos, as far as the sound, the way you guys recorded, the way it was phased, flangey. No other bands are really doing that, not even nationally, because I come to notice that a lot of bands nationally, after the time that you guys were playing in Detroit, and maybe some of them were around at that time too out of state, but bands like the Hooters, the Outfield, the Alarm, bands like that, and even a little bit of U2, because of some of your lyrical sensibilities in your songs, weren't out in the mainstream, or at least not in, pop radio or rock radio of any kind. So you guys just built this unique sound and unique writing style that was, was huge. Now, was in any way that just natural, or was that something like you had heard something and you said, well, we want to gravitate towards this style?
A lot of that style has to do with how the individual songwriters create songs.
Sure.
I guess the real stylistic collection is when you hear how Greg played. I had friends who were guitar players that I respected and that I really liked, that were sort of like from different schools, like the Keith Richards or Leslie West or something like that kind of school guitar playing, which always impressed me. I played guitar as a writing instrument, and I was always envious of my friends and some good friends who very, very well. When I met Greg, he was the guy who was able to create these chords that I'd never heard before. His idea of how the guitar should be layered is going to be such a big part of what it is that you're already talking about. So my very creative, talented guitar player, Greg Apro, is going to be a lot of that. Now, I'm also going to have to say, Davey Bass is an incredible songwriter. It's one of the things that him and I bonded on, like, right away. He wrote Broken Halos. Greg Apro brought the guitar riff. So think about that for a minute. Good song.
Yeah.
But like that guitar riff, it makes sense.
Not only the song riff, but the tonality, the sound of it.
But I'm also let's throw another person into the mix here, and that's Ben Gross, who is our producer. We were introduced to Ben Gross before we recorded anything for anybody. We were introduced to Ben Gross.
Right.
And he liked us, and we liked him, and we started recording at Pearl Sound. And this is a guy who went on to do, Seven Dust, Disturbed, Breaking Benjamin, Fuel, Filter, Marilyn Manson, B-52s, the list goes on and on. So we had a relationship with a world-class producer right off the bat, and that was huge.
Well, the other thing I was going to mention to you, I'm going to tell you a story that may make you laugh, and you may have heard it or may not have heard it. Like you had mentioned, your bass player basically wrote Broken Halos, and then the guitar player took it and put the riff to it. I have a story to tell you about a band he was in that I don't even know if you remember, or he may or may not remember, that was playing all covers at the time, and he brought that song to the band at that time and wanted them to play it. It wasn't their style. They were in the 70s. They were doing sounding more like, classic rock, Hendrix type of stuff. So they kind of pushed it aside and never did it. And then all of a sudden, you guys get together and it becomes, at least a huge regional hit. And the thing that was interesting to me, what I'm leading into, is that song was recorded, it was originally out when you guys were Rhythm Method, not Rhythmcore yet. And as a matter of fact, I found on YouTube a video you guys on the beat with Doug Podell, and he introduces you as Rhythm Method. Now, my question to you about that is, was this something later on when you were signed that they said, wow, that's a good album or a good EP, I guess it was at the time. Let's redo it, put it out again, but put it under Rhythmcore to help establish the band a little bit more. So how did that come about?
It's pretty simple. We were Rhythm Method when we began because, when you're coming up with a name for a band, sometimes it's just the name that everybody doesn't hate. It's like lowest common denominator shit. So it was just a name that we were like, okay, do you hate it, Greg? No, I don't hate it. All right, baby, I guess I can live. Band name is just something, Rhythm Method was something that everybody didn't hate, essentially. So that was the name of the band that we went in when we met a record company, Trans City. Originally they were Trans City, and then they changed to Metro America. And they were the ones who introduced us to Ben Gross. And we recorded the entire Paquet de Cinq, Packet of 5 EP for Trans City Records with Ben Gross. I don't know, 3-4 months into our pressings and starting to tour and stuff like that, and starting to get out and try to make something of this band and the record, somebody tapped us on the shoulder and said, you guys can't be Rhythm Method because we're Rhythm Method and my dad is a lawyer.
Oh, so somebody else had the name.
Yeah, and I was like, well, my dad's a tool and die shop owner, so fuck you. But we had to change the name. It's like, okay, all right, let's figure it out. You didn't have to push us too hard to have to change it. Right. Although the record company was like, what? And we were like, well, you gonna fight this? They're like, no. Then we went through it again. Man, it was brutal. Coming up with the worst names ever. Crazily enough, the secretary of the lawyer that we were considering using, this is also tense, said, how about Rhythmcore? And it's not. So somebody's mom, at some point, sitting behind a desk, doing the books for this lawyer, named my band.
To be honest with you, I think Rhythmcore is a lot better name. The other thing I was going to ask you about that EP, I can't pronounce it. Can you say the name of that EP again?
It's Paquet de Cinq. One of our original managers, frankly, Mike Halloran, who had a radio show called Radio's Emotion. And this is back in the early 80s. They were on DET, and this was the only radio station where you could hear the Buzzcocks, the Jam, XTC, Gen X, things like that. Japan. It was the only place you could hear that. And Michael was, Michael was involved in that.
Well, the reason I was asking, it was a real interesting title. A lot of bands weren't doing anything like that. To me, it reminded me of what the Police did. The early album names had, these kind of things too. So I was wondering if being of that time had anything to do with that.
No, Michael came to us, and now I remember where Michael came to us, and he had just, him and Richie had just spent a summer in London in 1977, 1978. And I guess one of the things that Michael brought back from Europe was that paquet de trois. When we were Rhythm Method, it made sense because packet of 3, and that's how you sell plastics in France. So it's a packet of 3. But he said, we're going to do a packet of 5, so we're going to call this record Paquet de Cinq. That is the reason that record is called that. We liked it so much.
You named your second EP like that, too.
For the next EP, we went with Esprit de Corps because it became something that we really liked. I almost wish that we had taken it into the next level, but we felt that calling our first album on a major label, Common Ground, not only followed the lead-off song, but also followed our cultural aesthetic at that time.
That's really interesting, like I said, that no one else was doing that at the time, coming up with names like that, other than, like I said, the Police was about the only one I could think of, but they're, from Europe. The other thing I wanted to ask you about that started on that album was the song Solidarity. The reason I bring it up is that, of course, you had it on that album, you put it on your second album, again, you put it on Common Ground. Was that a song that, really hit home with you guys? Did it have a special meaning? Why that one, and why, more or less, put it on 3 different albums?
It did have a special meaning. Probably one of the first songs that we really wrote as a band. I've said this before, but a lot of times Greg would come in with, when it comes to writing, Greg's very creative and he'll come up with something. And of course, Greg played with Richie before, like in the Plugs. Those two would always connect right away. And Davey, being who he is, immediately, I don't know that I don't think I appreciated it so much at the time, but like when I think back about it, it's like Davey was so malleable. He was such a fucking chameleon that like no matter what was happening with guitar and drums, he knew what to do. He knew instinctively what to do. And at least for our band. So, doing that song was like, Greg came in with like, it's like 9 notes or something like that. The band started doing it, and right away, the version that you hear on the record almost happened in the first 30 seconds. It just was like, bang. We just started playing that song, and it was like, we knew it was a great riff. We knew we had the rhythm and the bottom down, and I started vamping some just like, not even lyrics, but just like, vocal line. And at that point, just before that, David had said to me, I'm thinking of writing this song. It's called Solidarity. And at the time, Walesa and Poland were in this struggle back in the early 80s. So he goes, but I don't want it to be political. It's going to be like you and me, solidarity. All right, that's cool. As the song was going, I remembered that, and there seemed to be a natural place in the song for solidarity, for me to say solidarity. But after that, it was just like, because it was so powerful, this was not going to be a you and me solidarity. This was not going to be a love song. This was not going to be a relationship song. This was like, I knew that this was going to mean something a lot bigger. And I knew that everybody would be on board. There were some lyrics that came up. I've told the story before. I looked down. There was a flight that had left DC and it had gone down in Potomac. There were people on the sides of creating human chains to bring back whatever survivors there were. That was a picture on the free press. That as I was looking down and singing this song, I saw that. And so the first line, strength that binds us to the common purpose, is the first line of the song. So I had that, I had solidarity, and eventually within the next week, I hammered out the rest of the lyrics because the song itself was directed by Greg and Davey and Richie, how it was going to go. And so because that was kind of like our first band combination, you are going to see that showed up in a lot.
The thing I was getting at a little bit was like, it lends itself to the acoustic version and the acoustic thing. But you took it a step beyond that, because like on the Common Ground album, when you do it, it starts out just, you and the guitars and you're singing. And the one thing I noticed, and I don't know if this is on purpose or if it's just because there's, the one instrument you sing, your vocal line is really up front. And there's parts where it's almost like you're not, I don't want to say chanting, but, singing a certain way that as the song builds into the more electric version of it, all of a sudden it's full band, full on. Now, was that done purposely because there again, the feelings you had about the lyric and the situation that led you to write the song?
The lyrics were very important to me. I wrote the lyrics for the song. I wanted to make sure I was getting them right. And I also wanted to make sure that I was expressing them correctly. It's very personal and it has its own sort of like, what we try to do sometimes come off as a little ham-fisted. Heard that critique before, but I will tell you that no matter how much you think maybe we're being hyperbolic or something, but we absolutely believe when we're recording what we're doing.
I love all your stuff, everything I've heard for years from the very beginning. But of course, Common Ground, that album, every single song on that album, in my opinion, there's no filler, none. Every song on that album is an epic unto itself because of the sound and the sensibility of the lyrics. They are not typical of what you would have heard bands at that time doing. You guys weren't singing about sex, drugs, and rock and roll and getting laid and anything. You were coming up with lyrics that meant something. Now, I'm sure not everybody read that into it as much as I may. That's another thing that set, I think, your songs, at least to me, apart from that time. Because like I say, every song, like Father's Footstep, you can hear the emotion, you can hear the fact that you really feel these songs. They mean something to you. They're not thrown into the puddle. And is that something that there again you consciously wanted to create with that album also, to keep that?
not just the album, man, but like what we did, what we presented when we went on stage. You know, like I said, I mean, I'm the oldest member of the band,
Okay.
but we all grew up in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And we all had our idols were people who created social change with their music. And, you know, in 1980, so let's see, 88, which is when Common Ground would have been released.
Right.
87 when we recorded it, 86 when we probably wrote it. We weren't in a time that I thought was critical to democracy. But there were a lot of telltale signs what was coming. So we focused on that lyrically, or I'll say I focused on that lyrically, and it just seemed to work for the songs that we were doing. I knew that the lyrics that I was doing were working with what Greg was writing or what I was writing, Davey was writing, and so there was an effort to harken back that sort of like those socially relevant lyrics. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Because the thing about it to me, when I mentioned some of those bands, it's like, in a way, they kind of sound like, I don't want to say protest songs, but, you know, something.
Well, they were protest songs.
Yeah.
You can say it.
But but not overly harsh. It wasn't like, you know, Sunday Bloody Sunday and they're talking about a revolution.
No.
You guys were a lot more, you know, creative as far as the lyrics went.
What was the song that I wrote on the second record? It was called Voice of Reason, which is how I always hoped that those lyrics would be perceived.
That's awesome. And as for, well, we'll jump back again a little bit before that. When did you get signed? Were you signed just prior to the Common Ground album as to move out to California, or was it signed after that?
Oh, no. We picked up stakes and moved to California. Our manager at that time was Randy Sawson, still, by the way, one of my dearest friends. Ben Gross, by the way, still one of my dearest friends.
So where was the Common Ground album recorded? Was that recorded here in Michigan, or was that recorded in New York, LA? Where was that actually done?
Common Ground, the song that you hear on the record, was done with Ben Gross in Detroit.
At Pearl Sound?
At Pearl Sound. And the rest of the record was done in Los Angeles with Randy Bishop and Spencer Crawford doing the production. And Randy Bishop, our first producer, I mean, just really the most idealistic guy, one of the most idealistic guys I've ever met. That was a guy who would have put on armor and a sword and battled the rhythm board. That's who he was. But that said, when it came time to pick the song that was going to be the lead off, I listened to both versions. There was a version that was done by Randy. There was a version that was done by Ben Gross. And I had to say that the version we did with Ben Gross, which basically took half a night, versus the version we did with Randy, which took half a week, I chose Ben Gross. That was not an easy argument. I think I picked the right one. I think we picked the right one.
Now, the other thing is, your management, were they the ones that encouraged you? Because I know a lot of bands back then, you know, had aspirations like, oh yeah, we're going to go out to California, we're going to make it, we're going to do this and that, and either don't do it, don't have the gumption to do it, or go out and find out they're up against thousands and thousands of other bands stuff, and it's just real competitive.
It's brutal out here. It's brutal out here.
What was the factor that made you say, okay, we are going to make this break, we are going to go out?
I will tell you, honestly, us and our label mates, Figures on a Beach, we're killing it in Detroit.
Right.
We were like, we're murdering it. And we could go to Ann Arbor, we could go to Eastern Michigan, we could do all of the colleges and all of the clubs. And regionally, it was tremendous. It was, first of all, can I just say that it was so much fun? I don't know that I'll ever have that kind of fun. It was so good. It was so good. I loved those audiences. But we also knew that we would hear something like, oh, now I'm going to throw some names at you that don't make any, that nobody's going to reference. But like Roberta Peterson from Warner Brothers was going to be in Ann Arbor on X night or this night. At the time that we were doing this, Detroit and the surrounding areas were basically secondary, third, or even third markets to any of the people from the major labels that were looking to sign bands.
Sure.
And so we played our asses off, and we tried to get signed out of Detroit, but nobody was showing up. And so we said we've got to roll the dice, pick up everything that we own, throw our fate to the wind, and move to Los Angeles. And one of the guys that really helped us do that was my manager at the us out. He wasn't my manager, he was a friend, but he became a manager, Randy Sawson. And he brought us out here to California, found an investor, put us up in a house who was like us. There were so funny. I mean, you know, our situation was not unusual. Investor puts band in-house in Hollywood to record for the records, to record something that somebody's going to pick up on. We were not the first ones to do it, but that's how we came to Los Angeles, and we got our band house. There were 4, and I'm going to put this in air quotes, bedrooms, and we rehearsed in a place called Valley Center Studios in Van Nuys. Realized that being a band in Los Angeles was being like an auto worker in Detroit. Everybody's doing it, and it was hard to stand out. But I guess the good news is this Randy Bishop and Spencer Proffer, who were our first label, saw what we were doing and liked it and signed us. And we were signed within the first, I'm going to say 5 months of being out in Los Angeles.
Right.
That was, at the time, that was quite an achievement.
Now, did the band just go there to more or less get signed, proceed as far as recording? Were you guys playing out there at all? Were you playing like the Whiskey or any of the LA clubs?
I mean, a little bit, yeah. But like mostly we were recording. I mean, we did some showcases. We did, the showcase that we got signed on was we did the Roxy. Everybody knows the Roxy, right? That was the show labels came out to see us on, and Spencer Proffer and Randy Bishop said, come with us. And we said, okay. We did a couple of shows. Came to Los Angeles first in 84. We got signed in 87, but we came in 84 with Mike Hammer and played all of the cool LA clubs that if I say this to an LA person, they're like, you played what? We did Madame Walks, East and West. We did Club Lingerie, Cafe de Grand. We played the clubs in LA that were kind of pretty much the punk classic clubs.
You had mentioned the Roxy, and from my knowledge of the Roxy and the Whiskey and all those clubs, especially in the 80s when you're talking mid to late 80s, weren't those more like breeding grounds for like hair bands, metal bands?
Oh yeah, but like we were there and we were talking to booking agents who were booking Jane's Addiction, and Jane's Addiction had not been signed, and there was a bidding war. And so on one side you've got Poison, on the other side you've got Jane's Addiction. Can you imagine a more wider spread of like what you might want to do? It hadn't quite gone to Motley Crue, but it was going there. We played the Roxy and we, you know, I think we did okay. And then we played, you know, Club Lingerie and we did okay. Being a little modest here, we did fine. We did good because of who we were. And I'm going to say this because of who we were, not only who we were, but where we were from. And that being from Detroit and bringing that ethos out there, that ethos out there, was kind of a big thing. Stood up and paying attention.
The thing I was going to mention to you too, and like I say, the albums, and specifically Common Ground, was the other thing that was so great. You could go see you guys live, because I remember seeing you at Hart Plaza, and I saw you at the Ritz and all the other places at the time. Your live sound lent itself, so well to your recordings. You know, a lot of people will criticize bands, okay, you sound like this on record, and you sound nothing like that live. Well, you guys carried the ball. It was like a perfect blend between the studio mixes and the live thing. You know, it just sounded...
Wow, good point.
It sounded so great, and there were few bands that could do that, you know, on a local level or a national level.
Again, it's who we work with. We work with 3 sound men, and that's it. There was 3 guys that we worked. Mike Lilly, who has historically done the Romantics for a while. Cool Chris Anaki. I'm going to just say that name because he's a classic Detroit icon. And then we worked with Carl Monforte, who eventually was our long-term rhythm core as you know it sound man. We worked with him without pause, without bumps, without stop for our entire career once we brought him on, and he was always amazing. Wow. And you know what? When we go back and do shows, when we do our reunions back in Detroit, who do we get? We get Carl Monforte.
Now, what studio, or studios I should say, I don't know if it was more than one, did you record at when you were out in LA or out in California?
Out in LA, we recorded at Complex, and we recorded at Pasha Studios, which was the label of our Epic label.
So, as far as rhythm core, now I believe the last time time you played here, your last, like you call it, reunion thing, might have been either 23 or 24. You were part of the WLZ Wheels 3 record that came out, and you guys played a sold-out show at St. Andrews. The reason I bring that up is I didn't get to go to that, unfortunately. I wanted to, but the night before, I was at the Wheels celebration for that same record at the Caddo Cafe with all the other bands. You know, there was the Cadillac Kids were there, Keno G.
Oh my God, yes, Baz and Company.
Derek St. Holmes was there because he was on it with
Derek
Ted.
St. Holmes, yeah.
And then for some reason I couldn't make it out the next night. I don't know if I got a little.
Oh my God, fuck. That sounds like a good show.
It was a good show. Well, the last thing I'd like to ask you is about the song Common Ground. Now, not about the song itself, because it's interesting to me, because that song went, I think it went to number 12 on one of the charts, one of the major charts.
Yeah.
So which year was that? Was that Billboard?
Billboard Modern Rock or something like that, or Crossover Pop or something, I don't know.
What's interesting to me about that, and what's cool, is that was so, at the time, there was no other band that, you know, started out like you guys did and went through the phases, second to the Romantics, that even charted like that, you know? And here you are, it's a big national hit, it's out there. My question to you this is not about the lyrics or anything about that, was when was the first time when you were actually signed and you felt, you know, you might have made it when you heard that on the radio as far as nationally, maybe out in California or on the road?
Well, it's not going to be when we knew that it was out there. It's going to be as we were on tour and we graduated from a 8-passenger van and trailer to an actual tour bus, and then showed up at the gig and realized we could ask the people at the gig to take out all of the brown M&Ms. Davey and I looked at each other and we were like, we could get these guys to take out all the brown M&Ms, couldn't we? And I was like, yeah we could. I was like, do you want to do that? He was like, no, of course not. He's like, I love brown M&Ms. Like, that was the moment.
Wow. Do you remember the first time you heard that song? I mean, the one that was on that album, though, on the radio. Yeah. Were you in Detroit at the time? Were you on the road?
No, we heard it we heard it how, we did 3 songs with Ben Gross at Full Sound. And they were all as good, not better, than 2 EPs we had done before. And Ben had just, like, his ability to create great mixes had just, like, jumped exponentially. And so we heard that back then. 2 of the other songs did not make it onto the album, and I kind of get that, but Common Ground did. So we were already very, very familiar with that mix when we went to Los Angeles, and that mix is what got us Billboard chart.
But of course, then you did a video for it too. Now, was that video done out in LA?
Yeah, the video was done by the guy who. So we were kind of fans of Bauhaus. Something else became something else.
Yeah.
But the guy who did the video for whatever band I'm talking about was Tony Van Den, and Randy, who was our manager at the time, was very, very knowledgeable about video directors, and just that whole world. This is the guy we should get. And so we brought him in, and we worked with Tony Van Den, and it was a great experience. He had weird ideas. We were like, listen, this is what we do. We know music. We don't know this other stuff. We're just going to do what we do. You tell us to play, and we're going to play like we play, and roll camp. And that's how that went.
Yeah, but you still got to put a lot of trust in these people, you know, to hopefully be able to get in some sort of 4 or 5 minute video.
Remember, the machine at that time was a behemoth. It was huge. It was Duran large. Video, music, broadcast. So Tony Van Den had a good pedigree. We went with him.
It obviously worked. What was the last song? The last song that I remember that got radio airplay, at least here, I mean, Common Ground went on and it continued to go on, was playing here and nationally, was Satellites on your last album. Now, did that do anything as far as the charts or nationally at all? Did you do anything with that?
Not really, but we were proud of that song.
Oh, a great song.
But it was, no, it really didn't do what we hoped it would do, and it certainly didn't do what the record company hoped it would do. do. And also, it came up at the exact moment that Nirvana came up with Smells Like Teen Spirit. We were literally held up like, well, look at this and look at this. It's like Nirvana and rhythmcore. And we weren't doing that. We were still doing this sort of like experimental thing that we love. We were still trying to, I mean, like, honestly, if things had gone different, we would have continued to experiment. I promise you that. It would have been with like whatever instrument came to mind. But that said, that year didn't really work out. The record label got rid of everybody on the label except for two bands. One was Rhythmcore and the other was the Godfathers. Birth School were done. Right. And that worked for a minute, and then that person went. And all of a sudden, we were like the Godfathers, orphan in Sony Records.
In other words, do you think, with the scene obviously changing, musical landscape, because you mentioned, Nirvana and the whole grunge scene coming along, that kind of may have pushed bands like you guys aside because, hair metal went away, and 70s arena rock, that kind of thing. Were you you feel in a way pushed aside as far as the musical landscape because of that?
Well, there's no other way to put it, yeah. I mean, like, that is exactly what happened. They signed a slew of Seattle bands that fit that sort of mold, and we weren't there.
Were you ever pressured at that time from your label, since you were the last two that were on it, to possibly, hey, go with the flow, change it up, get a little heavier, not necessarily go grunge, a bit more distortion on the guitar as far as that?
No, of course. The thing is you've seen Rhythm.
Many times.
We're not the Carpenters.
No.
It is a band that, like, there will be blood on the stage at the end of every Rhythmcore show, I fucking guarantee. So, regardless of, like, the songs that you're thinking that represent us, we're a rock band. We always have been. And unfortunately, when you get into this world of broad strokes, at least at that point, we were not recognized as that. The only recognition element of us was Common Ground. It's a 12-string guitar followed by lovely interludes by Greg Apro and Davey Bass and Richie Loveson, and well produced by Ben Gross. But that's not what Seattle sound was.
Right.
So, no matter what you listen to about Rhythmcore, you didn't go past the Common Ground, and that hurt.
Of course, because like I said, you guys, not just talented musicians, but like I said, your lyrics, they meant something. And to be that strong and be that effective at a time when you were talking a lot of hair metal bands, and that was what stood out, to me at least. And I think people that really dug the band, I think, had a great appreciation of the fact that, you weren't out there faking it. You weren't out there doing this. This really meant something to you personally from every aspect. I just can't say enough good things about the way you guys held yourself together, stood your ground. You're obviously up against a lot going up there and doing that, but still, you didn't sell out your integrity to be, to stay rock stars.
We're down a long line of a very respectable pedigree.
Absolutely.
In Detroit. It's like the MC5, Johnny Angelos and the Rotations, or our friends like the Romantics, and Mike Skill from the Romantics specifically, bands like the Junk Monkeys. These are bands that really just focused on what was between them, the microphone, and the audience. Right. And that was all they fucking focused on. That is Detroit.
Well, Mike, I'm going to let you go. I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day, especially getting off.
That's a lot of fun, man. I hope it was a good interview.
Oh, it was an excellent interview, man. I really appreciate all the stuff. I've learned a lot. I really hope that you guys will get at least one more show under your belt.
I will tell you this. There will absolutely be another show. It's going to take a lot of effort on our part because we never take these things lying down. Rhythmcore is never taking anything lying down. We don't assume anything. In this next show, we've already done enough reunion shows that we have to bring something new. So I would say that if you're going to be there, it's going to be because we've got, whether you've heard it or not, something else to talk about. And I would love to see you there, and I would love to have you out.
Absolutely. And as far as that, it sounds like it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. Would there be any chance of that song coming out, being recorded, whether it's just on Spotify or whatever? Would that be something you do, or you just do
that would be the intention. Greg's already sent me some great stuff that I really, really like, and some lyrics that I think are okay. Davey is always on board. Richie is always on board. Yeah. The good thing about Rhythmcore individually is what you can say about us is we're game.
Well, anyway, Mike, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out to doing this. I really appreciate it. Forward to seeing you guys again somewhere down the line and hearing some new music from you.
Well, listen, I appreciate you digging in and asking interesting questions, so thank you.
All right, you bet. All right, Mike, again, thank you so much. And you have a very good evening, sir.
I'll say what I always say at the end of every show.
Yes, sir.
Cheers, peace, and good night.
Yeah, same to you, sir. Have a good night.
Fires up to the top, up in the
Well, that was Mike Persh from Rhythm Corps, one of my favorite bands that dug from the early 80s right on up. From the first time I heard, like I said, Broken Halo, Solidarity, right up into their big number 12 charting song, Common Ground, which is still a staple in classic rock radio, I think, across the board, and definitely here in Detroit from where they are. The sound of the band, like I was saying to him, is just so incredible. The blend, the mix, the way the tonality of the instruments work against his vocal style and his lyric, they meant something. They were, at a time, like he said, it was a different time. They were, like he said, protest songs, but they weren't overly preachy protest songs. They made you think. You had to really listen to them and kind of like say, oh, okay, I get it. That's what this guy's talking about. And just exceptional. And I look forward to hopefully seeing them down the line. Hopefully, like he said, they get a couple new songs or whatever, and they can get back to Detroit and play another show, hopefully sooner than later. Anyway, hey, is that old stereo system of yours giving you the blues? Maybe the receiver has a blown channel or the turntable just doesn't work right. Well, then you should visit my friends at 7 Grand Audio Service. Don't let the sign fool you. Yes, they did repair TVs and VCRs and still do from occasion, but their real forte is in stereo systems, stereo components, whether they're vintage or whatever. They've been in business for over 40 years. They're located at 25642 7 Mile Road in Redford. The owner Dash and his assistant Harry can fix just about anything. Receivers, tape decks, turntables, EQs, power amps, and yes, guitar and bass singing. The phone number over there is 313-533-3635. They're open Monday through Friday, 10 to 6. You need to check them out and tell them Jimmy sent you. Anyway, with that said, as I'd like to say, keep rocking.